You've sliced them, cooked them, cried over them, and probably never questioned them. Red onions and white onions sit side by side in almost every grocery store, looking like simple choices in a simple produce aisle, but the truth is, these two ordinary vegetables carry a story most people never hear. Why does one come in a deep purple-red skin, while the other shines pale and bright? Why does one taste sharp when raw but sweet when cooked? And why do recipes sometimes insist on one type as if the entire dish depends on it? You might be surprised to learn that the real difference between red onions and white onions goes far beyond color. To understand it, you have to peel back their history, their chemistry, their journey around the world, and the strange way humans came to rely on them in everyday cooking without fully knowing why. Most people assume red onions and white onions are basically the same, just grown in different colors and on the surface. They do look like close cousins. They share the same shape, the same layered structure, the same tear-triggering aroma. But once you take the time to look closer, the differences start to feel much more interesting. The contrast between them is a mix of ancient agriculture, regional preference, plant chemistry, and surprisingly emotional human biases. It turns out that the onion you choose often says more about your habits, your taste memory, and even your culture than you might expect. But before we dive into all that, let's start with the simplest question you could ask. What actually makes an onion red or white? That sounds like an easy question, but it reveals a surprisingly deep part of plant biology. Your brain might immediately jump to the idea of food coloring or special soil, but the truth is both simpler and more fascinating. Red onions get their color from natural pigments called anthocyanins. These are the same pigments that turn blueberries blue, grapes purple, and cherries a deep reddish tone. Anthocyanins act like protective shields for plants, helping them absorb certain kinds of light and defend against stress. The more anthocyanin a plant produces, the deeper its color becomes. So a red onion isn't just painted red, it has built-in plant chemistry that changes the way it reacts to light, soil, and even cooking. White onions, on the other hand, don't have those pigments. Their pale flesh is the result of fewer protective compounds and a slightly different genetic makeup. Without anthocyanins, the layers stay bright and milky, letting more of the onion's natural sugars and sulfur compounds take center stage. These sulfur compounds are what give onions their bite, and also what make you tear up when cutting them. But here's something interesting. White onions actually tend to have higher sulfur content than red onions. That means they can be sharper, stronger, and more pungent, especially when eaten raw. If you've ever chopped a white onion and felt your eyes sting immediately, that's the sulfur doing its job. So, does that mean red onions are sweeter? Not exactly. Many people claim red onions taste milder, especially when raw. And while there's some truth to that, it's only part of the story. Red onions usually have slightly more natural sugar than white onions, but not enough to dramatically change the flavor. The real difference comes from how those sugars interact with the pigments and the lower sulfur content. That combination means red onions can taste gentler at first bite, especially in salads or sandwiches. White onions, meanwhile, bring a sharper, more straightforward onion flavor that cooks down beautifully and adds depth to hot dishes. It's not that one is better than the other. It's more like two different personalities growing out of the same family. But to understand why these differences came to exist, we have to go way back to the origins of onions. Onions are so old that historians aren't fully sure where they began. Some believe they originated in Central Asia, others point to the Middle East, and some guess they appeared naturally in various places at the same time. What we do know is that onions were one of the first cultivated crops in human history. Long before written language, people were growing onions for their ability to store well, survive harsh climates, and provide flavor in times when food was otherwise bland. Ancient Egyptians valued onions so much that they painted them on temple walls and buried them with pharaohs. They believed the circular layers symbolized eternity. White onions were likely more common in those early times. Since many early onion varieties leaned toward paler colors, red onions emerged later through selective growing, trade exchanges, and regional preferences. Different climates favor different pigments. In hotter regions, onions with anthocyanins survived sunlight better, making red onions naturally more common in cooler or cloudier regions. White onions thrive just as well, as onions traveled the world through trade routes, explorers, and farmers. Certain regions developed strong attachments to certain types. In parts of the Mediterranean, red onions became beloved for raw eating because of their milder bite and appealing color. In Northern Europe and North America, white onions grew popular for soups, stews, and hearty dishes that required cooking for long periods. These early preferences created cultural habits that still stick with us today. Even now, many recipes from Italian or Greek cuisine lean toward red onions. While classic American cooking often assumes white onions as the default, but color and history only tell part of the story. To really understand the difference between red onions and white onions, you have to consider how they behave once heat enters the picture. Heat changes onions dramatically. When you cook an onion, the natural sugars inside start to caramelize, turning brown and sweet. This process takes time, and it transforms the onion's flavor from sharp and biting to warm and mellow. White onions, with their higher sulfur content, undergo one of the most noticeable shifts. They can be strong when raw but comforting and smooth when cooked. That's why so many recipes that start with sauteing onions, like soups, curries, stir-fries, and meat dishes, often prefer white onions. They break down beautifully and blend into a wider range of flavors. Red onions also caramelize, but their anthocyanins don't always handle heat the same way. In some dishes, red onions turn blue or gray when cooked, which can change the visual appeal of a meal. This color shift doesn't affect taste, but it does explain why red onions are more commonly used raw. People love the contrast of their bright color against green salads, white cheeses, or golden brown breads. That pop of color is part of what makes red onions feel fresh and appealing. In the world of restaurants and food photography, that color goes a long way. But there's something else unusual about red onions. They react to acids in interesting ways. When you splash vinegar or lemon juice onto sliced red onions, something almost magical happens. The color becomes brighter, shifting toward a vibrant pink. That's why pickled red onions have such a striking appearance. The acid stabilizes the pigments, making them look even more intense. White onions don't have this effect because they lack the anthocyanins that react with acidic environments. This little piece of chemistry is one of the reasons red onions have become so popular in modern kitchens. They don't just taste good, they make food look good. Now, let's talk about something people rarely consider: the texture. Red onions often feel crispier when raw because their cell walls tend to be slightly thicker. This gives them a satisfying crunch in fresh dishes. White onions, meanwhile, have a more delicate structure and break down faster when cooked. Their texture becomes soft, almost melting into the dish. This difference is subtle, but once you notice it, you'll understand why certain recipes feel incomplete with the wrong onion. A raw salsa made with white onions might taste harsher, while caramelized red onions may not achieve the perfect brown sweetness you expect from a classic onion base in cooking. Of course, there are many misconceptions about both types of onions. One common belief is that red onions are healthier simply because they are colorful. And it's true that anthocyanins, the pigments that make them red, have antioxidant properties. These compounds are linked to potential health benefits. But the difference between red and white onions is not as dramatic as some people suggest. All onions, regardless of color, contain beneficial plant chemicals that support the body. They share similar nutrients, similar fiber levels, and similar vitamins. The real difference in health impact is relatively small, so choosing one over the other for health reasons alone isn't necessary. Flavor preference and cooking method matter far more. Another misconception is that one onion is always better than the other. For any recipe, in reality, chefs choose onions based on the final goal of the dish. If color matters, red onions shine. If depth of flavor is key, white onions do the heavy lifting. Many home cooks don't realize how much freedom they have You can substitute red for white or vice versa in most dishes without an issue. The dish may look slightly different or taste a little milder or stronger, but it will rarely fail. That flexibility is part of what has made onions a universal ingredient for thousands of years. So what is the real difference between red onions and white onions after peeling back history? Chemistry, flavor, regional habits, texture, and personal memory. The answer becomes surprisingly elegant. Red onions bring color, mildness, and crisp texture. White onions carry sharper flavor, deeper aroma, and a willingness to melt into nearly any cooked dish. One brings brightness, the other brings warmth, and together, they show just how much depth can hide inside something as simple as a humble onion dot in a way. The story of red onions versus white onions reflects something bigger about everyday life. We pass by ordinary things all the time assuming we understand them fully, only to discover later that they carry stories deeper than we imagined. The next time you stand in the produce aisle deciding between a red onion and a white one, you'll know that the choice isn't just about color, it's about chemistry, history, texture, tradition, and the quiet journey of a vegetable that has followed humanity for thousands of years. And maybe that's the real takeaway, even the simplest. Ingredients can hold surprising secrets if you're willing to take a moment and look a little closer.